Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
The Case of the Midnight Seraph. Chapter 1. The Midnight Seraph's Debut. For the better part of a week, St. Mary Mead had been in the grip of a peculiar and highly concentrated fever. It was not an ailment that would trouble Dr. Haydock, but rather a condition of the spirit brought on by the imminent annual flower show. In ordinary years, the competition was a gentle affair, marked by rivalries over the plumpest gooseberries or the most uniformly pink roses. This year, however, was different. This year, the village was to be graced by a celebrity. The celebrity was not, of course, a person, but a plant. And its owner, Mr. Alastair Blackwood, was as far from a celebrity as one could imagine. He had moved into the Laurels, a gloomy, secluded house on the Old Hall Road, some 6 months prior, and had remained a figure of intense and unsatisfied curiosity ever since. A botanist, it was said, and a wealthy one. He discouraged visitors, dismissed gossip, and contributed to village funds with a crisp check sent by post, a gesture that was seen as correct but decidedly cool. It was therefore a matter of considerable surprise when Mr. Blackwood announced his intention to enter the flower show. The surprise turned to awe when the nature of his entry became known, a Phalaenopsis seraphim nocturnum, a variety of orchid so rare it was spoken of in horticultural circles with the same reverence usually reserved for a lost Rembrandt. The village, with its love for simple, pronounceable names, had already christened it the Midnight Seraph. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a rather rickety folding chair in the corner of the marquee, observed the final preparations with her usual placid interest. Her knitting needles clicked with a soft, rhythmic constancy, a gentle counterpoint to the frenetic activity around her. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass, damp earth, and Mrs. Price's formidable rose-scented polish. Mrs. Lydia Price, the self-appointed commander-in-chief of the event, was darting about with a clipboard, her face flushed with importance. No, Mr. Croft, the delphiniums must go behind the sweet peas. It is a matter of aesthetic balance, she declared, her voice carrying across the tent. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The passion stirred by a village flower show, she reflected, were quite extraordinary. They mirrored, on a small and charming scale, all the great dramas of life, pride, jealousy, ambition, and, sometimes, a quite startling degree of cunning. A sudden hush fell near the Marquis's entrance, a pocket of silence in the general hubbub. Mr. Alastair Blackwood had arrived. He was a tall, severe-looking man in his late 50s, dressed in immaculate tweed. His face was thin and ascetic, and he carried himself with an air of brittle authority. But all eyes were on what he did not carry. That task fell to his assistant, a pale, anxious-looking young man named Peter Finch, who followed a pace behind, cradling a glass cloche with the terrified reverence of one carrying a bomb. Inside the glass, cushioned on a bed of moss, sat the Midnight Seraph. It was, even to Miss Marple's admittedly amateur eye, a thing of astonishing and unnatural beauty. It was not truly black, but rather the color of the deepest, darkest violet, so profound that it seemed to absorb the light around it. A single, perfect bloom, its petals like sculpted velvet, hung suspended on a delicate stem. "Good heavens," murmured Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, who had paused beside Miss Marple. "It doesn't look real. It's like something from a fairy tale." "Or a cautionary tale, perhaps," Miss Marple replied softly, her needles never missing a stitch. Mr. Blackwood directed the placement of his treasure with the precision of a surgeon. "Gently, Peter, gently. To the right, a fraction. It requires northern light, but without a direct draft. The humidity under the glass must remain constant." Peter Finch, whose brow was already beaded with perspiration, nodded mutely and shuffled the cloche into position on a small, velvet-draped pedestal. His hands trembled slightly as he withdrew them. He was a local boy, nephew to the publican at the Blue Boar, and his new position with the reclusive botanist had been a great source of village speculation. At that moment, another figure approached the display, her expression a careful blend of professional interest and personal pique. It was Miss Eleanor Vance, a fellow horticulturalist from the neighboring village of Market Basing. She was a woman of forthright opinions and a formidable grower of lilies, who, until now, had considered herself the undisputed queen of the local floral scene. "Alastair," she said, her voice a little too bright. "It is quite something." "Eleanor," Blackwood acknowledged with a curt nod, not taking his eyes off the orchid. "I have only ever read about the nocturnum variety in journals," she continued, moving closer. "The propagation is said to be fiendishly difficult. You must have exceptionally steady hands." It was a pointed remark. A rumor, started, some said, by Miss Vance herself, had circulated that Blackwood's successes were due less to skill and more to a bottomless purse with which he simply bought his specimens. Mr. Blackwood's thin lips tightened. "Skill is a matter of patience and precision, Eleanor. Qualities one must cultivate." The barb, subtle though it was, found its mark. Miss Vance's cheeks colored slightly. Her gaze fell upon the nervous assistant. "And you, Peter? You must feel very privileged to work with such a specimen." The young man flinched, as if surprised to be addressed. "Oh, yes. Very. Mr. Blackwood is a wonderful teacher." He looked to his employer for approval, but Blackwood was busy adjusting a small, silver hygrometer beside the cloche. The scene was set. The prize was in place, the rivals had circled, and the nervous guardian stood his watch. From her quiet corner, Miss Marple surveyed the tableau. Mr. Blackwood's obsessive pride, Miss Vance's acid envy, and poor Peter Finch's overwhelming anxiety. They were all very human, very understandable emotions. And it was exactly these sorts of simple, understandable emotions, she knew, that could so often lead to the most dreadful complications. The needles clicked, a soft and steady rhythm in the flower-scented air, like the patient ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment the show would begin. Chapter 2: A Commotion in the Marquee. The day of the flower show dawned bright and clear, with a light breeze that did little to temper the rising heat. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the marquee was a veritable hothouse, thick with the competing scents of roses, stocks, and warm humanity. The aisles were a dense throng of familiar faces, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, admiring the sweet peas, the Reverend Clement and his wife, Griselda, tasting the vicarage jams, and Dr. Haydock, who was making a slow, judicial circuit of the vegetable displays. Miss Marple had found herself a strategically placed chair near the tea stall, a vantage point that offered both a slice of Victoria sponge and an excellent view of the marquee's main thoroughfare. From here she could see the roped-off pedestal where the midnight Seraph sat in its glass prison, drawing a constant stream of admirers who spoke in the hushed tones one might use in a cathedral. Mr. Blackwood stood guard nearby, his arms folded, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. His assistant, Peter Finch, hovered at his elbow, looking pale and harried, repeatedly wiping his palms on his trousers. A little farther off, pretending to inspect a display of fuchsias, was Eleanor Vance, though her gaze strayed frequently towards her rival's triumphant exhibit. The judging was underway. Sir Henry Clithering, who had been persuaded to act as the head judge, was leading his small committee on their solemn tour. They had praised the Bantry's sweet peas and marvelled at the size of a marrow that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Now, they were making their way towards the orchid section. A palpable sense of anticipation settled over the crowd. This was the moment of the day. Sir Henry adjusted his monocle. "And now, Blackwood," he began, his voice booming slightly, "we come to the main attraction." He never finished the sentence. The interruption came not from a person, but from a small, wire-haired terrier named Binks, who belonged to a visiting cousin of Mrs. Bantry. With a sudden yelp of joyous freedom, Binks slipped his lead and shot like a furry cannonball across the marquee. His target, it seemed, was a dropped scone near the tea stall. His trajectory, however, intersected precisely with that of a young girl from the Women's Institute, who was navigating a large, wheeled trolley laden with the afternoon supply of tea urns, milk jugs, and an entire battalion of china cups and saucers. The result was pure pandemonium. The trolley tilted, wavered for a heart-stopping second, and then surrendered to gravity with a crash of apocalyptic proportions. China shattered. Tea, hot and brown, cascaded across the grass. Binks, finding himself in the middle of this deluge, yelped in surprise and began barking hysterically. Women shrieked. Men shouted. For a full 2 minutes, every single person in the marquee, from Sir Henry down to the smallest child, turned to stare at the magnificent chaos. The judges were flustered, Mrs. Price was aghast, and a frantic search for the dog's owner was instantly underway. Miss Marple, who had been fortunate enough to be just out of the splash zone, watched the scene with a calm, bird-like attention. It was, she thought, a most effective distraction. Her eyes, however, had not been entirely fixed on the crashing trolley. In the first instant of the commotion, her gaze had swept, almost instinctively, back towards the center of the tent, towards the prize everyone had been so eager to see. It took some time for order to be restored. The dog was captured, the mess was attended to with mops and apologies, and a sense of flustered good humor returned. "Well," exclaimed Sir Henry, wiping a spot of tea from his lapel. "A spot of excitement, eh? Now, where were we? Ah yes, Blackwood. Your orchid." He turned back towards the velvet pedestal. And then he stopped. The committee stopped behind him. The slow wave of silence that followed was more shocking than the crash had been. Mrs. Price, bustling over to offer her personal apologies to Mr. Blackwood, was the first to give voice to the silence. She put a hand to her mouth and let out a thin, piercing scream. "It's gone!" The whisper ran through the marquee like fire through dry grass. "Gone!" Everyone surged forward, a wave of bodies craning to see. The pedestal was bare. The magnificent, impossible black orchid, along with its glass cloche, had vanished into thin air. There was nothing left but the small, white display card, lying flat and looking utterly forlorn. "No one leaves the tent," bellowed Colonel Bantry, assuming a military command that had been dormant for 20 years. Accusations began to fly. "It was that Vance woman. I saw her looking," someone declared. "Check everyone's bags," cried another. In the midst of the rising panic, Miss Marple observed the main players. Eleanor Vance looked utterly thunderstruck, her face white with genuine shock. Alastair Blackwood's reaction was the most peculiar of all. There was no grief in his expression, no sense of personal loss. Instead, his face was a portrait of cold, incisive fury. "Fools," he hissed, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Incompetent, bumbling fools. His anger seemed directed not at the thief, but at the sheer chaotic inefficiency that had allowed the theft to occur. It was Griselda Clement who voiced the question that was beginning to form on everyone's lips. "Wait a moment," she said, looking around. "Where is that boy? Where's Peter Finch?" All heads turned. The anxious young assistant, who had been a permanent shadow at Blackwood's side, was nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared as completely as the orchid itself. Miss Marple's needles, which had paused for a moment, resumed their gentle, rhythmic work. A daring theft. A perfect distraction. And a missing boy. It was all very neat. Almost, she thought, a little too neat. It reminded her of a conjurer she had seen as a girl in London, a man in a magnificent waistcoat who could make a canary disappear from a cage. The secret, he had explained to the audience with a wink, was not in the speed of the hand. The secret was in making absolutely certain that everyone was looking somewhere else entirely. And everyone, she reflected, had been looking at the tea trolley. Chapter 3: The Empty Pedestal. The arrival of the constabulary transformed the marquee from a scene of communal dismay into a formal crime scene. The festive air had entirely evaporated, replaced by the sober, methodical tramp of police boots on the flattened grass. Tea-stained cups and prize-winning roses were now pieces of a puzzle, and every guest a potential witness. In charge of the proceedings was Detective Inspector Dermot Craddock of the County CID. He was a man in his 40s, with a sharp, intelligent face and a manner that was reassuringly calm. He was also an old acquaintance of Miss Marple's, having encountered her unique talents on a previous, rather tragic occasion. He greeted her with a respectful nod as he entered the tent. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I might have known that if something peculiar were to happen in St. Mary Mead, you would be somewhere near the heart of it." "Wonders get about, you know, Inspector," she replied, her expression mild. "Even at my age. A most theatrical business. All that crashing and shouting. It quite put one off one's cake." "Theft is rarely a tidy affair," Craddock remarked, his eyes scanning the marquee. "And this seems a particularly audacious one. A priceless object vanishes from under 50 pairs of eyes." He gestured to the empty pedestal. "Right. Let's start with the owner." Mr. Alastair Blackwood had been escorted to a quiet corner, and it was there that Craddock began his formal questioning. Miss Marple, while appearing to be engrossed in a complex pearl stitch, was well within earshot. "A terrible shock for you, Mr. Blackwood," the inspector began. "It is a professional catastrophe," Blackwood corrected him, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "The specimen was the result of a decade of work. Its genetic markers were unique. Can you put a monetary value on it, sir?" Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "An absurd question. Can you put a value on the Mona Lisa? Its worth lay in its singularity, not in its price tag. That said, I imagine a collector of a certain, unscrupulous nature would pay a small fortune. And you have no idea who might do such a thing." "I have a very clear idea," Blackwood stated flatly. "It was my assistant, Peter Finch. It is the only logical conclusion. He knew the orchid's true importance. He knew how to handle it. And he has, as you can see, vanished. Did he have any reason? Was he in some sort of trouble?" Craddock probed. "The boy was weak," Blackwood said with cold certainty. "Always anxious. Worried about money, I believe. His family is not well off. The temptation was clearly too great for him. I imagine he arranged the diversion with some accomplice and simply walked out in the ensuing chaos." The theory was neat, concise, and damning. It was also precisely what the police were beginning to suspect. Peter Finch was the only person who was unaccounted for. A search of the grounds had yielded no sign of him. The official police theory was already taking shape. Next, it was Eleanor Vance's turn. Her interview was a study in contrasts. Where Blackwood had been cold and precise, Miss Vance was flustered and defensive. "It's outrageous," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation. "To think I would have anything to do with this. I am a respected member of the Royal Horticultural Society." "Nevertheless, Miss Vance," Craddock said patiently, "you made no secret of your professional admiration for the orchid." "Admiration? Inspector, I was green with envy, and I don't mind who knows it. Of course I was. Any botanist would be. But steal it? Never. My reputation would be ruined. Can you tell me where you were during the commotion?" "I was standing right over there," she said, pointing a shaking finger towards the fuchsia display. "And when that dreadful dog caused that crash, I turned to look, just like every other soul in this tent." "Is that a crime now, to be curious?" Her alibi, as Craddock noted in his little black book, was the same as everyone else's, which meant it was no alibi at all. She was a plausible suspect, driven by a motive as old as time, professional jealousy. The afternoon wore on. Statements were taken, names were listed, and a general sense of weariness descended. The hunt for Peter Finch was now the official priority. His description was being circulated, and the local constabulary were making inquiries at the train station and bus depot. To Inspector Craddock and his men, it seemed a straightforward case of a foolish young man making a ruinous mistake. Later, as the crowds were finally allowed to disperse, Miss Marple found herself walking towards the Lichgate with Sir Henry Clithering. "A nasty business, Jane," he remarked, shaking his head. "Craddock seems to have it well in hand, though. Thinks the boy will turn up in London, trying to pawn the thing and making a dreadful hash of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her gaze distant. "It does seem the most common-sense explanation, doesn't it?" "Certainly. The boy had the opportunity and, it would seem, the motive. He plans a distraction, grabs the plant, and bolts. It's simple." "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured, pausing to look back at the great white tent, now looking deflated and sad in the evening light. "It is so very simple. But in my experience, human nature is so rarely that. Poor Peter. He always struck me as a boy who was afraid of his own shadow. It seems so unlike him to concoct such a bold and theatrical plan. It reminds me of Tommy Simmons, the grocer's boy. He was once accused of stealing a whole wheel of Stilton. But I knew he couldn't have done it. He was a dreadfully timid lad, you see, and he had a terrible fear of mice." Sir Henry looked at her, a quizzical expression on his face. "Mice, Jane? They are so often found near cheese, aren't they?" she said with a gentle smile. "One must always consider the nature of the person. And I am not at all certain that we have considered the true nature of anyone involved in this affair." "Not yet." Chapter 4: A more sinister discovery. The morning after the flower show felt strangely subdued. The marquee, which yesterday had been a hub of life and color, now stood silent and empty, a ghostly white shape against the blue summer sky. The news of the theft, and of Peter Finch's disappearance, had travelled through St. Mary Mead with the speed of wind-blown gossip. The consensus, voiced over garden hedges and in the queue at the baker's, was one of sorrowful disappointment. To think that a local boy, one of their own, could be responsible for such a brazen crime was a bitter pill for the village to swallow. Inspector Craddock's men were still on the scene, conducting a methodical search of the grounds. Their focus was on finding the stolen orchid, or rather, the glass cloche that housed it. A heavy, cumbersome object like that could not be easily concealed or carried far. The theory was that Peter had an accomplice waiting in a motorcar on the lane behind the village hall. The search, therefore, felt more like a procedural formality than a hopeful hunt. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, her thoughts occupied with the inconsistencies of the previous day. Mr. Blackwood's cold anger, so devoid of any real sense of loss, and the character of Peter Finch, so ill-suited to that of a daring criminal. It was, she thought, like a badly cast play. The roles simply did not fit the actors. The person who shattered the police's neat theory was not a detective with a clue, but a grumpy groundskeeper with a schedule. Old Mr. Croft had been tending the village hall gardens for 40 years and was a man of unbending routine. The flower show had thoroughly disrupted that routine, and he was determined to restore order. His first task was to clear out the potting shed, which had been used as a chaotic storage space for the event. He entered the small, dusty shed, grumbling to himself about the mess. Pots everywhere, twine all over the floor, for disgrace, that's what it is. His gaze fell upon a pile of hessian sacks, lumped in a corner where the spare bags of lawn feed were usually kept. They were heaped up awkwardly, as if thrown there in a great hurry. With a sigh of irritation, he took hold of the topmost sack to drag it away. It was heavier than it ought to be, and the shape beneath was wrong. He pulled it aside, then another. And then he stopped. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. Sticking out from beneath the brown sacking was a smart leather shoe, and above it, the cuff of a tweed jacket. Mr. Croft stumbled backwards out of the shed, his face the color of putty, his mouth opening and closing silently. He finally found his voice, and the raw, terrified shout that ripped through the quiet morning air brought a constable running from the other side of the lawn. Within half an hour, the atmosphere at the village hall had changed from one of routine investigation to one of grim, urgent horror. A second, more somber police car crunched up the gravel drive, this one carrying Inspector Craddock and Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple saw them arrive and knew at once that the nature of the inquiry had fundamentally altered. She watched from her garden gate as they disappeared into the cluster of outbuildings behind the hall. It was some time before they re-emerged. Inspector Craddock's face was set like granite. Dr. Haydock looked grave. He intercepted the doctor as he was heading back to his car. "Doctor," she said, her voice quiet. "Bad news, I fear." Dr. Haydock, a man not easily shaken, took off his hat and wiped his brow. "The worst, Jane. It's the missing boy. Peter Finch." He lowered his voice. "He's in the potting shed. He's been dead since yesterday afternoon." "An accident?" she asked softly, though she knew the answer. "No. Not a chance of it. He was struck from behind. A single, heavy blow to the back of the head with something blunt and very hard. Death would have been instantaneous." He shook his head. "A dreadful business. To kill a boy like that, monstrous." The discovery ripped the case wide open. Peter Finch was not the thief, he was the victim. The entire theory, so neat and plausible, had been a lie. Back at the scene, Craddock was re-evaluating everything. "The timeline," he said to his sergeant. "Haydock puts the time of death between 3 and 4 o'clock yesterday. Right in the middle of the flower show. Right around the time of the commotion." The sergeant looked bewildered. "So the thief killed him, sir?" "No," Craddock said slowly, his mind racing. "You're not seeing it. This changes everything. The boy wasn't killed for the orchid. The orchid was stolen to hide the fact that the boy had been killed. He paced back and forth in front of the shed. Think it through. The killer lures Peter into the shed and strikes him down. He hides the body. But now he has a problem. Sooner or later, the boy will be missed. A search will begin. The body will be found. So what does he do? Craddock stopped and turned to his sergeant, his eyes glinting with a new, hard understanding. He creates a bigger, more immediate crime. A crime with a ready-made suspect. He causes a diversion, steals the orchid, and vanishes. Everyone assumes Peter Finch is the thief and has fled. It sends us all chasing off in the wrong direction, looking for a runaway boy, giving the killer hours, a full day, perhaps, to cover his tracks. The theft wasn't the crime. It was the alibi. From her garden, Miss Marple watched the grim proceedings. A terrible sadness settled over her. Her instincts had been right. The play had been miscast because the script itself was a fabrication, a clever piece of misdirection designed to fool the audience. It put her in mind of a dreadful fire at the Allens farm when she was a girl. The whole village had turned out to watch the magnificent, terrible flames licking at the night sky. No one, in all the excitement, had noticed the Allens' neighbor quietly loading their best silver into his pony trap next door. But this was infinitely worse. For it was not silver that had been stolen away under the cover of the spectacle. It was a young man's life. Chapter 5: Whispers and Gardenias. While Inspector Craddock and his men concerned themselves with the grim mechanics of the murder, timetables, forensics, and the search for a weapon, Miss Marple knew that the truth of such a tragedy was seldom found in footprints or fingerprints. It was a matter of character, of secrets, of the whispers that hang in the air long after a voice has fallen silent. The police were searching for a heavy, blunt object. Miss Marple was searching for a motive. Her own quiet inquiries began, as they so often did, with a visit. She found Mrs. Lydia Price at the village hall, directing the final, melancholy stages of the clean-up with a tragic air. The vibrant marquee was gone, leaving only a flattened square of grass, and Mrs. Price looked like a general surveying a lost battlefield. "Jane, my dear, isn't it simply dreadful?" she began, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, though they were perfectly dry. "To think. A murder. Here. Our little show will be remembered for it. It's a stain on the village." "It is a great sadness," Miss Marple agreed, her tone gentle. "And for poor Peter's aunt, a terrible blow. You know, Lydia, I was thinking about our conversation yesterday. Just before the commotion. You mentioned that you heard Peter arguing with someone." Mrs. Price's expression sharpened, her grief momentarily forgotten in the thrill of possessing important information. "Yes. I told the inspector all about it. It seems so much more significant now, doesn't it? Frightening, really. Did you happen to recall anything else about it?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze resting on a crushed petunia by the path. "The other person's voice, perhaps." "Well," Mrs. Price puckered her lips in concentration. "It was a man's voice, I'm certain of that. A low voice. Not a loud shouter, but insistent. There was a hard edge to it, you know? An angry rumble. And Peter, who was usually so timid, bless him, he sounded just as cross. His voice was higher, of course, but it had a defiant little tremor in it. As if he were standing up to someone he oughtn't." She shook her head. "I still couldn't see who it was for those dreadful delphiniums. But it wasn't a voice I recognized from the village. A low, insistent, unfamiliar voice. And Peter, the nervous assistant, finding the courage to argue back. It was a very important piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple thanked her friend and made her way towards the laurels. It was, after all, a Christian duty to offer condolences to the boy's bereaved employer. For this purpose, she carried a small, beautifully potted gardenia from her own conservatory, its white, waxy petals a perfect symbol of sorrow. Mr. Alastair Blackwood's house was as severe and unyielding as the man himself. He answered the door with the same cool composure he had shown in the marquee, his face a mask of formal regret. He accepted the gardenia with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "A kind thought, Miss Marple. Do come in." She was shown once more into the unnaturally tidy study. The room was so immaculate it seemed to hum with a kind of sterile tension. Not a book was out of place, not a pen sat at an angle. It was the room of a man who craved absolute control. A terrible development, Miss Marple began, seating herself on the edge of a hard-backed chair. "One's heart goes out to the boy's family." "Indeed." "A most unfortunate business," Blackwood replied, his voice as dry as dust. He stood by the mantelpiece, his posture rigid. "It has complicated matters for the police enormously. They were on a clear path, and now they are adrift in a sea of speculation." Miss Marple noted his choice of words. Complicated matters. Not a human tragedy, but a logistical problem. "They no longer believe the orchid was the reason for it all," she ventured. "So I gather," he said coolly. "They now seem to think the boy stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. A ridiculous notion. What could he possibly have found here? My work is botany. It is not, I assure you, a dangerous profession." As he spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted around the room. Her eyes, so often mistaken for being vague and dreamy, were taking in every detail with crystalline precision. And then she saw it. It was a tiny thing, easily missed, but in that obsessively clean room, it stood out to her like a scream. On the polished parquet floor, just by the leg of the heavy mahogany desk near the French windows, was a small, crescent-shaped smear of dried mud. It was dark reddish-brown and flecked with tiny stones. It was a clay soil, heavy and clinging. Miss Marple, a gardener to her very bones, knew the earth of St. Mary Mead. This was not the rich, dark loam of Blackwood's manicured beds, nor the peaty compost from his greenhouse. This was the clay from the river bank, or from the old churchyard, where she knew the soil was notoriously poor. It was an earth that told a story of a place outside this sterile, carefully guarded house. "I imagine Peter had access to the whole house?" she asked, her voice betraying nothing of her discovery. "Within reason. He was here to assist with my work, not to wander about. He was primarily in the greenhouses or this study. He was a good boy, but not inquisitive." Miss Marple murmured her assent, her mind racing. The out-of-place mud. The angry, hushed argument. The cold, dispassionate employer. The threads were beginning to connect. The murder of Peter Finch had nothing to do with a rare flower stolen in a moment of chaos. It was rooted in something far deeper, something that had been brought into this house like a speck of dirt on a polished shoe. She took her leave soon after, offering a few more gentle platitudes that were met with the same cool civility. As she walked down the gravel path, the scent of her own gardenia seemed cloying and funereal. She thought of Mr. Pethurst, the solicitor who had retired some years ago. A man of immense and painstaking precision, yet he always had a faint smudge of blue ink on his right cuff. It was his one small, recurring oversight in an otherwise flawless presentation. Mr. Blackwood's presentation was flawless, too. But the small smear of mud on his floor was his ink smudge. It was the one detail he had overlooked, the tiny, telltale link between his perfectly ordered world and a violent death in a dusty potting shed. Chapter 6: A Matter of Identity and Ink. Inspector Craddock was a man who prided himself on logic and procedure. At present, both were failing him. The investigation into the murder of Peter Finch had ground to a frustrating halt. The search of the potting shed and surrounding grounds had failed to produce a conclusive murder weapon. Every resident and visitor present at the flower show had been questioned, and each one had the same unshakable alibi: they had been watching the commotion of the tea trolley. The crime was a sealed room in which the walls were made of 100 pairs of eyes, all looking in the wrong direction. It was a routine report from a constable tasked with looking into the victim's life that provided the first truly incongruous detail. "We've been through his room at his aunt's pub, sir," the constable reported, standing stiffly in the temporary police office at the village hall. "Nothing much of note. But we looked into his finances. He was, as Mr. Blackwood suggested, in a bit of a hole. Owed a month's rent, had a small slate at the butcher's. But then there's this." He placed a small, cardboard evidence box on the table. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a fountain pen. It was a handsome thing, made of marbled green resin with a gleaming gold nib. "A Conway Stewart," the constable said. "We checked with the stationer in Market Basing. Young Finch bought it last Tuesday. Paid £7.10 for it. It was practically the last of his wages for the month." Craddock picked up the pen. It was heavy, a serious instrument for a serious writer. So, a boy who can't afford to pay his rent spends a small fortune on a luxury pen? It makes no sense. "No, sir," the constable agreed. "It does not." The perplexing detail was filed away, another loose thread in a case that was rapidly unraveling into a tangled mess. Meanwhile, in the quiet of her own sitting room, Miss Marple was engaged in a task of delicate precision, mending a tear in a piece of old lace. Her needle moved with a slow, steady rhythm as her mind worked on a different kind of problem. She was thinking of Mr. Alastair Blackwood, of his perfectly ordered house, his cold, controlled manner, and the out-of-place smear of mud. There was a rigidity to the man, an obsessive perfectionism that seemed to go beyond mere tidiness. It put her in mind of Mr. Sedgwick, a man who had lived in St. Mary Mead years ago. He had been a brilliant calligrapher, capable of producing the most exquisite, flawless script. He created wedding invitations that were works of art. But his personal life, as the whole village knew, had been a shambles of unpaid bills and secret debts. He created a perfect, orderly world on paper to compensate for the chaos he could not control in his life. Was Mr. Blackwood doing something similar? Was his house a stage, his manor a costume? The idea, once it took root, was a stubborn one. The performance was just a little too perfect. That afternoon, she sat down at her writing desk, took out a sheet of her favorite Basildon bond paper, and wrote a letter to her nephew, the author Raymond West. After the usual inquiries about his wife and children, and a brief, carefully edited account of the dreadful business in the village, she came to the point in her own inimitable, roundabout way. The gentleman involved, a Mr. Alastair Blackwood, is a new resident here, though I believe he is quite the expert in his field, orchids, of all things. One feels he must be terribly well known in certain circles. You, my dear Raymond, with all your clever friends in London, might have heard of him. He is such a very precise and steady man, I have found myself wondering about the nature of his work. Any little thing you might hear would be of such interest to your old aunt. She posted the letter and waited. The reply came 3 days later. Raymond, clearly amused by his aunt's sudden interest in botany, had been remarkably thorough. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began to read. My dear Aunt Jane, I did as you asked and made some inquiries about your Mr. Alastair Blackwood. He is, as you suspected, a giant in his field. A bit of a legend, according to a friend of mine at Kew Gardens. A total recluse, famously eccentric, and the world's foremost authority on Asiatic phalaenopsis. He has published several definitive monographs on the subject. So your village has indeed landed a celebrity. Miss Marple felt a faint pang of disappointment. Her theory, it seemed, was nothing but an old woman's fancy. Blackwood was exactly who he claimed to be. She read on. The interesting thing, however, and the reason for his reclusiveness, is a rather tragic medical condition. It seems the poor fellow has suffered for years from a severe hereditary tremor. My friend says it's got progressively worse over the last decade. It affects his hands quite badly, so much so, in fact, that he has been unable to write, or even handle his delicate specimens himself, for a very long time. He dictates all his research and employs a team of assistants to carry out any practical work requiring a steady hand. A great mind, trapped inside a faltering body, as my friend put it. Miss Marple lowered the letter into her lap. The ticking of the clock on her mantelpiece sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Her mind flew back to the marquee. She saw the man in the tweed jacket, his hands resting firmly on the display case. She saw him in his study, accepting the gardenia she had brought him with a grip that was perfectly stable. She saw his signature in the Flower Show's entry book, a crisp, controlled script she had glanced at on the day. There was no tremor. There was not the slightest hint of one. The man living at the Laurels, the man who had employed and, perhaps, been argued with by Peter Finch, was not the real Alastair Blackwood. Her gaze drifted to the window, but she did not see the roses in her garden. She saw, instead, the deepening shadows of a far more complex and dangerous mystery. If the man was an impostor, then the murder of Peter Finch was not merely a village crime. It was an execution carried out to protect a fundamental lie. And why, she wondered, her mind making a sudden, intuitive leap, would a young man who had stumbled upon such a dangerous secret need to buy himself a fine new fountain pen? Chapter 7. The Unraveling Thread. Inspector Craddock, though a patient man, was nearing the end of his tether. With the trail of Peter Finch's murder growing colder by the hour, he decided to apply pressure to the one person who possessed a clear motive and a hopelessly weak alibi, Eleanor Vance. He summoned her to the village hall, and in the stark, functional room that served as his temporary office, he laid out the case against her. You had a public and professional rivalry with Mr. Blackwood, Miss Vance, he began, his tone quiet but firm. You were overheard making pointed remarks. You admit to being intensely jealous. And during the 5-minute window in which the crime was committed, you have no verifiable alibi whatsoever. Eleanor Vance, who had arrived full of blustering indignation, seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. Her face crumpled, and to Craddock's surprise, she burst into tears. I didn't kill him, she sobbed. And I didn't steal that wretched orchid. But it was my fault. The commotion. Craddock waited, his expression unyielding. I paid the Bletchley boy 10 shillings to let his terrier off the lead, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to create a diversion. A few moments of confusion. I was going to use my small secateurs to snip a tiny cutting from the back of the stem. For propagation. It was a dreadful thing to do, I know, but I was desperate. He was so smug, so insufferable. Go on, Craddock said, his eyes fixed on her. I did as I planned. When the trolley crashed and everyone turned, I slipped through the crowd towards the display. But when I got there, it was already gone. The entire cloche. vanished. There was just the empty pedestal. I was so shocked, I nearly fainted. I thought someone had read my mind and beaten me to it. I just crept back to my spot, my heart hammering in my chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Someone else used my silly little plan for their own purpose. But I never touched the boy, Inspector. I swear it on my life. Her confession, so pathetic and entirely believable, cleared her of the greater crimes but left Craddock with an even more tangled timeline. The killer had acted with phenomenal speed, seizing an opportunity that they could not have known would arise. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple was taking her customary stroll. It led her, as if by its own volition, past the quiet grounds of the parish church. She saw old Mr. Croft, the groundskeeper, leaning on a spade near the ancient yew tree that guarded the western gate. "A warm afternoon, Mr. Croft," she said pleasantly. "That it is," he grumbled, wiping his brow with a red handkerchief. "And this soil don't make it any easier. Heavy clay. A proper battle, it is." He gestured with his spade towards a patch of freshly turned earth nearby. "Had to dig up one of the new yews we planted only last week. Died on us. Left a right proper hole, it did. Had to leave it open for a day or two to let the air get to the soil before the new one arrived." He squinted at the spot. "Right over by the old Finch family plot, as it happens. Poor lad. To think he'll be joining them now, long before his time." Miss Marple murmured her sympathies and continued on her way, but her mind had seized upon his words. A right proper hole, left open for a day or two, by the Finch family plot. She returned home and sat down in her favorite chintz armchair, picking up the soft pink wool she was knitting into a scarf. The needles began their rhythmic dance, but her mind was moving far faster. The threads, which had been a hopeless tangle of mismatched colors, were suddenly pulling straight. First, the man himself. Not Mr. Blackwood, but an impostor with steady hands and a desperate need for a reclusive identity. Second, Peter Finch. A local boy, familiar with the churchyard and its occupants, both living and dead. He discovers the deception, how, it didn't matter for now, and in his desperate need for money, he decides on blackmail. Third, the fountain pen. The tool of his new, dangerous trade. He buys it not for show, but to write a letter that would give his demands a weight and formality his nervous persona could not. Fourth, the argument. The angry, hushed confrontation Mrs. Price overheard. The impostor, his carefully constructed world threatened, agrees to a meeting to pay the boy off. He lures him to the potting shed. Fifth, the murder. The meeting is a trap. The boy is silenced forever. Sixth, the problem. A body. A body that will be missed. The killer needs time. And seventh, Mr. Croft's freshly dug, open hole in the churchyard. A temporary grave, waiting. The killer hides the body in the shed, knowing he cannot leave it there. That night, under the cloak of darkness, he transports the body to the empty plot. And in doing so, he gets that heavy, clinging churchyard clay on his shoes, which he then tracks into his immaculate study. But to give himself that night, he needed a distraction. He needed to turn the search for a missing person into the hunt for a runaway thief. Miss Marple smiled, a sad, grim little smile. The theft of the midnight Seraph. It was all so clear now. It was just like young Barnaby Fitzwilliam, who, having broken his mother's prized porcelain poodle, proceeded to tip over the entire china cabinet. In the ensuing storm of tears and recriminations over a dozen smashed plates, no one even thought to ask about the little poodle until it was discovered days later in the dustbin. The orchid was the china cabinet. A spectacular, dazzling piece of misdirection to hide a single, grubby, heartbreaking crime. Her needles stopped clicking. She laid the soft pink wool aside. Her expression, usually so mild and placid, was now one of resolute clarity. She knew who, and how, and why. All that remained was to set the stage for the final act. She walked over to the telephone in the hall and lifted the receiver. "Operator," she said, her voice calm and clear. "The vicarage, please. I should like a word with Mr. Clement. I believe it is time we invited a few friends for tea." Chapter 8. Tea at the Vicarage. The drawing-room at the vicarage was, in Miss Marple's opinion, a most suitable place for uncomfortable conversations. It was so determinedly civilized, with its slightly faded chintz armchairs, the scent of beeswax, and Griselda Clement's indomitable silver tea service, that any display of raw, unseemly emotion would seem doubly shocking. They were all there. Inspector Craddock, looking official and watchful. Dr. Haydock, his intelligent gaze filled with clinical curiosity. A pale and nervous Eleanor Vance, who had clutched her teacup as if it were a life raft. And, seated a little apart from the others, the man from the laurels, looking as cool and immaculate as ever. He had accepted the vicar's invitation with a polite, if faintly condescending, curiosity. Griselda served the tea, her movements betraying a nervous tension that was shared by everyone in the room, save for their hostess. Miss Marple, serene as a china doll, took a small sip from her cup before she began. "It is so kind of you all to come," she said, her voice gentle and unassuming. "A dreadful business like this leaves so many questions in the air. One feels the need for a little clarity." She looked towards Eleanor Vance. "You, my dear, have been so very distressed. You believed your silly little plan with the dog was the cause of everything. But you see, it wasn't. You were merely an unintentional contributor to a piece of theatre already in progress. The truth is, the Midnight Seraph never really mattered at all." Inspector Craddock shifted in his chair. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" "It was the china cabinet," she said with a placid smile. "When young Barnaby Fitzwilliam broke his mother's favorite porcelain poodle, he tipped over the entire china cabinet to hide his crime. In the dreadful fuss over all the broken plates, no one thought to look for the little poodle. The theft of the orchid was the broken china cabinet, a loud, spectacular crash designed to make everyone look in the wrong direction." She turned her mild blue eyes towards the man from the laurels. "The real crime, you see, had already taken place. The real crime was the murder of poor Peter Finch in the potting shed." The man gave a thin, dismissive smile. "And why, in your estimation, would anyone kill the boy and then steal my orchid? The logic is absurd." "Oh, but the logic is perfectly sound," Miss Marple replied softly. "If you start from a different place. Not with the orchid, but with a secret. A very large and important secret, upon which a person's entire life depended. Let us suppose that Peter, a quiet and observant boy, stumbled upon that secret." She paused and took another sip of tea. "He was in debt. He was desperate. And so, he decided on a very old and very dangerous course of action, blackmail. He bought himself a fine new fountain pen, an instrument, one might say, for signing a contract or a demand. We know he had a fierce argument with a man whose voice was not recognized from the village. He was, I believe, making his demands." The man from the laurels steepled his fingers. "This is a fascinating work of fiction, madam." "Is it?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. The man he was blackmailing could not afford to be exposed. He agreed to a meeting in the potting shed to pay Peter off. but he had no intention of paying. He killed the boy. But then he had a dreadful problem. A body. He needed to hide it, and more importantly, he needed time. Time before anyone would even think to look for a body. So, he used the commotion in the marquee to steal the orchid and vanish it, creating the perfect scapegoat. Peter Finch was not a missing person, he was a thief on the run. It gave the killer at least 24 hours of freedom. Craddock leaned forward. Freedom for what? To move the body, of course, said Miss Marple simply. To a temporary grave. Old Mr. Croft, the groundskeeper, had just dug a deep hole in the churchyard to replace a dead yew tree. It was left open. And it happens to be the same heavy, clay soil as the mud I noticed on the floor of your study, Mr. Blackwood. Brought in, I suspect, on your shoes after a grim piece of work late that night. The man's composure was absolute. You have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple. A smudge of mud and a dead boy's pen hardly constitute proof. No, you are quite right, she agreed. But the secret does. You see, I was so curious about your work. I had my nephew make some inquiries. The real Alastair Blackwood, the celebrated botanist, is a man afflicted with a terrible tremor in his hands. A condition so severe he can neither write nor handle his own specimens. Yet your hands, sir, are as steady as a rock. A sharp intake of breath came from Eleanor Vance. The man's face paled, but he did not speak. The final piece of the puzzle, Miss Marple continued, her voice filled with a quiet sadness, was provided by Peter himself. Or rather, by his family. His uncle, who runs the Blue Boar, used to deliver ales to the Blackwood family estate in Dorset many years ago. He told Peter stories. He remembered the brilliant son, Alastair, who was already showing signs of his affliction. And he remembered Alastair had a younger brother. A less successful brother, a failed academic who lived in his shadow and managed his affairs. A brother named Robert, whose hands, his uncle recalled, were always perfectly steady. The man, Robert Blackwood, sat frozen in his chair. The mask of cool intellectualism had shattered, revealing something cold and hollow beneath. Your brother died over a year ago, didn't he, Mr. Blackwood? Miss Marple said, her voice now barely above a whisper. And you, who were so used to living off his reputation, simply stepped into his shoes. You inherited his identity, his research grants, his royalties. You buried him quietly and moved here to St. Mary Mead to live out his reclusive life. But Peter, prompted by his uncle's story, put it all together. He knew you were a fraud. And he tried to profit from it. It was a fatal mistake. Robert Blackwood slowly placed his teacup on the saucer. The sound was the only noise in the silent room. He was a stupid, greedy little boy, he said, his voice flat and empty of all emotion. He wanted £500. He would have kept coming back for more. It was untidy. I simply tidied it up. Inspector Craddock rose slowly to his feet, his face grim. Robert Blackwood, I am arresting you for the murder of Peter Finch. Robert did not resist. As he was led away, a hush fell over the vicarage drawing-room. The tea grew cold in the cups. Later, as the evening sun cast long shadows across the lawn, Miss Marple sat with the vicar. It is so often the way, she murmured, looking out at her peaceful village. The greatest deceptions are not born of great ambition, but of a simple, desperate desire to keep things just as they are. It is a very human failing. She sighed, a soft, weary sound. But it can lead to the most inhuman acts.